We are fortunate to have a transportation leader who acknowledges not only the vibrant and diverse culture and lived experiences of the disability community, but who also has lofty goals for our continued progress and pushes the department to wield its authority to advance accessibility, mobility, and inclusion for people with disabilities in the traveling public and within the transportation sector. Without further ado, I am pleased to introduce the 19th Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, who is joining us virtually. Mr. Secretary.
Well, thanks very much, Irene, for the introduction and for the great work that you and your team are doing. And I'm so pleased to be able to join with everybody who's here today. Again, I'm Secretary Pete Buttigieg. I have short brown hair. I'm seated in front of a blue background with the logo of our department and an American flag and the flag of the Department of Transportation. I want to thank all of the disability advocates joining us in the audience today, both at the DOT and online. And I want to recognize the significance of this day. 32 years ago, on March 12, 1990, 1,000 activists from across the country descended on Washington, D.C. to protest their government's failure, as of then, to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act. When they arrived at the National Mall, dozens of them cast aside their wheelchairs, crutches, and other assistance devices, and some began to crawl up the steps of the Capitol. One of them was an 8-year-old girl who was the same age that I was at that time, declaring, quote, "I'll take all night if I have to." 4 months after that, the ADA was signed into law. The Americans with Disabilities Act is without question one of the most impactful pieces of civil rights legislation in the history of America. It expanded rights for 1 in 4 people in our country and transformed every aspect of our lives, from work to school, and of course, transportation, for the better. Today, it is such an essential set of protections and standards that I think we run the risk of taking it for granted. So it's worth remembering that at the time it was being debated, the ADA faced a great deal of opposition. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce said it would have, quote, "a disastrous impact on many small businesses struggling to survive," end quote. A congressman in my own home state said that it would, quote, "federalize American private enterprise," end quote. And the nation's largest bus company predicted that the ADA would, quote, deprive millions of people of affordable intercity public transportation. Of course, none of those things happened. Instead, our schools, workplaces, and communities changed so much for the better that in many ways it's hard to imagine a life without the ADA. 1 in 4 Americans has a disability. And any American who doesn't have one today might develop one later on. In fact, 2 in 5 people over the age of 65 have a disability. So the reality is that sooner or later, a large percentage of Americans will all end up benefiting personally and directly from the landmark civil rights afforded to us by the ADA. Yet for all the progress that we've made, we have yet to live up to the promises of true equality and full accessibility that were enacted in that law 32 years ago. 1/3 of adults with disabilities don't have a primary care physician. People with disabilities are twice as likely to be unemployed as people without. When it comes to transportation, 3 decades and counting after the ADA, nearly 1/4 of all train stations in the country still aren't accessible. That's not right and it's not fair. And I can think of no better moment than this anniversary of the ADA to emphasize how we are redoubling our efforts to ensure people with disabilities can move freely, fairly, safely, affordably, and spontaneously through every part of our transportation systems. I'm pleased to announce that a few days ago, we at the DOT officially adopted a new set of disability policy priorities, which will guide our work over the next several years, and which you can read about at transportation.gov/accessibility. Those priorities include everything from improving our data gathering, to strengthening our enforcement of key legislation, to advancing diversity and accessibility in our own US DOT workforce. And I want to highlight a few items in particular right now. First, we're working to make sure air travel is safe and accessible for everyone. We've already taken some big steps on that front. In March, we proposed a new rule that would increase the size of airplane bathrooms to better accommodate passengers who use wheelchairs, knowing that no one should have to choose between dehydrating themselves and avoiding air travel altogether. Earlier this month, we also released our Bill of Rights for airline passengers with disabilities, so that you can know exactly what rights you are entitled to when you fly, and so we can better hold airlines accountable. These are important steps to improve the safety and the dignity of air travel, and we can and should do more. Earlier this year, I met with Charles Brown, a Marine Corps veteran, and the president of Paralyzed Veterans of America. He shared the story of how poorly trained airline employees once dropped him onto the jet bridge while removing him from his wheelchair during boarding, breaking his tailbone and causing an infection that he barely survived. And practically everyone who uses a wheelchair and flies, including colleagues of mine here at the DOT, has a troubling story about an airline experience. Many have far more than one. No other form of transportation, trains, buses, boats, forces you to give up your mobility device when you board. And the same ought to be true of airlines. So in the months and years ahead, we plan to work toward a new rule that will allow passengers to stay in their personal wheelchairs when they fly. We know this won't happen overnight, but it is a goal that we have to work to fulfill. And in the meantime, we've announced plans for a rule that will hold airlines accountable for how they handle passengers in their wheelchairs, ensuring that they do so safely and responsibly. Another of our priorities concerns technology. By now, we've all heard about self-driving cars, and we've thought about their revolutionary potential to help people with disabilities and older Americans get around more easily. Also know that new technology can always cut both ways. We have to make sure that accessibility is part of the design conversation from the very beginning. That's why DOT started the Inclusive Design Challenge. It's a competition to identify the most promising ideas for making automated vehicles accessible for people with a broad range of disabilities, whether physical, sensory, or cognitive. In a few minutes, you're going to hear more about the winners of that challenge. And in the years ahead, we're going to continue working with designers and manufacturers to ensure that these take the unique needs of every possible user into account. The same goes for electric vehicles and the technology that we use to charge them. Through the President's bipartisan infrastructure law, we're building a network that will have 500,000 EV chargers nationwide by the end of the decade. And last week, the U.S. Access Board published new guidance to help ensure that those chargers are accessible for people with disabilities. Finally, I want to discuss how we're using funding through the infrastructure law to modernize old, outdated, inaccessible public transit stations. As I mentioned before, over a quarter of stations still fall into that category. Now we have a chance to fix that. I'm proud that today we are launching the All Stations Accessibility Program, or ASAP, a new initiative to retrofit old rail and subway stations with federal funding through the bipartisan infrastructure. It's going to mean adding elevators, ramps, and other physical and sensory improvements so the 1 in 7 Americans who have a mobility disability can finally rely on transit to get to work, go shopping, see family, and simply go about their lives. There may be resistance to some of the policies that I've discussed and others that we're pursuing. We may hear claims that they place too great a burden on airlines or automakers or transit agencies. We have to remember that is exactly what they said about the ADA itself 32 years ago. History proved them decidedly wrong, and I believe it will again. The fact is, improving accessibility benefits everyone in this country, those with a disability and everyone else. When people with wheelchairs can fly safely, that means more customers for airlines. When new cars are accessible, more people will buy them. When we improve transit stations, that means more fare revenue to use to improve the system, less traffic on the road for drivers, and less pollution in the air for all of us. And accessibility means that not only will people with disabilities be accommodated, but they are empowered to fully contribute to families, to workplaces, and to communities. That's why everyone is better off when anyone can get to where they need to be. All of these efforts are rooted in countless hours of conversation and engagement with the disability community. And we are grateful for the experience, the perspective, and the wisdom that so many of the advocates here today have shared with us. As we saw it so powerfully with the Capitol crawl, creating an accessible country and a more perfect union requires that our policies reflect the voices and the lived experiences of this community. It makes our country a better place to live with a disability. It makes our country a better place to live, period. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Emily Vorty, someone who, as a colleague and friend, has taught me a great deal about traveling with a disability, and someone who is doing terrific work in the administration, the White House Associate Director of Disability Outreach. Emily, over to you.
Thank you so much, Secretary, and thank you for those in the room. We are so grateful for the Secretary's leadership, vision, and unrelenting commitment to access for Americans with disabilities. To give a brief visual description, I am a white woman with just past shoulder length blonde hair, and today I am wearing a blue floral wrap dress. My name is Emily Vorty, and I have the immense privilege to serve as the Biden administration's liaison to disabled Americans. I was born in South Bend, Indiana in 1992. In utero, I was diagnosed with osteogenesis imperfecta, a condition that causes my bones to break easily. That diagnosis placed me on the shoulders of a legacy of activists who just 2 years prior to my birth demanded passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Judy Heumann, Justin and Yoshiko Dart, Hy Feldblum, Patricia Wright, Max Starkloff, Lex Frieden, and countless others envisioned a future where disabled Americans would be liberated, not oppressed. Today, 32 years to the day after the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, we celebrate America's progress towards full participation, equal opportunity, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for disabled Americans. The All Stations Accessibility Program will ensure access to entire communities, entire regions, for the 1 in 7 Americans with mobility disabilities. To be perfectly clear, presently, there are American cities in which I cannot visit, cannot consider living or working in, cannot spend money in, cannot visit, because I am a person with a disability that uses a wheelchair. The All Stations Accessibility Program will invest in outdated transit infrastructure in cities coast to coast, allowing access to public education, healthcare, competitive employment, local tourism, and community living for millions. As Secretary Buttigieg mentioned, in-case benefits for countless Americans with disabilities and those aging into disabilities isn't enough. Accessibility benefits all Americans. Accessible transit streamlines commuting patterns, decreases pollution, and provides support to those traveling with strollers, carts, and luggage. The Department of Transportation's commitment to moving towards a rule that will allow passengers to stay in their personal wheelchairs when we fly is not only a matter of access, but a matter of justice, a matter of dignity. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say I do not know a single mobility device user who has not had their equipment damaged by a commercial airline. The ability to stay with our equipment not only protects it, but protects our agency and our physical well-being. Make no mistake that these announcements today and those to follow are a direct response to the advocacy of disabled Americans. Leadership, including Secretary Buttigieg, has listened, and they have taken bold steps to ensure that the long overdue promises of the Americans with Disabilities Act are secured. So today, let us celebrate the progress of the past 32 years. Let no legislation, no guidance, no regulation, no program be taken for granted. But tomorrow, let us all recommit ourselves to the legacy of our community's leaders as we fight for a more inclusive, accessible, just future for disabled Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, for joining us, and thank you, Secretary Buttigieg, for your important remarks, your reminders of that history that really centers and grounds the work that we are here today to celebrate, but also to advance and accelerate.